There was a moment in automotive history when Ford made a decision so unexpected, so contrary to everything the company stood for, that even its own engineers questioned whether it was real. Not a V8, not a turbocharged 4, a V12. Built quietly, tested seriously, and aimed at a market Ford had never touched before. Most people have never heard of it. The ones who have tend to dismiss it as a footnote, a rumor, or a misfire. But the full story is far more complicated than that. This was not a concept car built for a motor show. It was not a styling exercise designed to generate headlines. Ford's engineers actually ran this engine. They mapped it, tuned it, and pushed it through development cycles that cost real money and real time. The question was never whether it could be done. Ford had the resources. The question was why. Why would the most American of American automakers chase a configuration that belonged to Jaguar, Ferrari, and Lamborghini? The answer, when it finally surfaces, says everything about the era, the pressure, and the strange ambitions quietly circulating in Dearborn during one of the most turbulent decades in the industry's history. The car at the center of this story never made it to a showroom, but it came closer than almost anyone knows. That car was the Ford V12 program. The late 1980s and early 1990s were not a comfortable time to be an American automaker. Japanese manufacturers had spent the previous decade systematically dismantling Detroit's finest reputation. Honda, Toyota, and Nissan were no longer just selling economy cars. They were winning on quality, winning on reliability, and increasingly, winning on prestige. Lexus arrived in 1989 and immediately made Cadillac look like it had been sleepwalking for 20 years. Ford was watching all of this very carefully. The company had already surprised the world with the Taurus, a car that proved American designers could think differently. But the executive floor wanted more. They wanted a statement, not just a better sedan or a refreshed sports car. They wanted something that would force Europe to pay attention, something that would sit in a showroom and make a buyer in Stuttgart or Munich genuinely reconsider their options. The problem was credibility. Ford did not have a luxury bloodline. It did not have decades of grand touring heritage to lean on. What it had was engineering capacity, an enormous development budget when the timing was right, and a growing belief inside Dearborn that the company was capable of something genuinely world-class. The V12 was not born out of arrogance. It was born out of insecurity, and that made it far more dangerous as a project. Insecurity in the automotive world has a long history of producing either complete failures or absolute legends. The man most connected to Ford's luxury ambitions during this period was not a designer or a racing engineer. He was a strategist. And the strategy, at its core, was built around one acquisition that changed everything. In 1989, Ford purchased Jaguar. Suddenly, the company that built the F-150 owned one of the most emotionally powerful automotive brands in the world. And with Jaguar came something Ford had never internally possessed, a legitimate reason to build a 12-cylinder engine. The platform's potential was immediately obvious to the engineers who understood what was actually being discussed. A V12 developed under Ford's ownership could serve Jaguar's flagship sedans, anchor a new Grand Tourer, and simultaneously signal to the market that Ford's luxury ambitions were not cosmetic. This was the hidden logic that made the program survivable inside a company that would normally never approve such an extravagant configuration. But there was resistance. There were executives who saw the Jaguar purchase as a liability from day one. Men who believed Ford's identity was built on volume, accessibility, and value. A V12 was none of those things. It was slow to build, expensive to engineer, and completely irrelevant to the buyers purchasing Escorts and Mustangs in their millions. The internal conflict was real, and it shadowed the program at every stage. What kept it alive was the quiet conviction of the engineers actually doing the work. They believed they were building something that could genuinely compete with BMW and Mercedes at the very top of the market. The engine that emerged from this program was not a rushed compromise. Ford's engineers approached the V12 with a methodical seriousness that surprised even the skeptics inside the company. Early architecture decisions were made with longevity in mind. This was not a racing engine dressed up for road use. It was designed from the beginning to be refined, smooth, and capable of covering enormous distances without strain. The kind of engine a buyer expects when they spend the equivalent of a European executive's salary on a motor car. As development progressed, the numbers began to climb in ways that made the program harder to ignore. The displacement grew. The power output reached a level that placed it directly in competition with engines that had taken European manufacturers decades to refine. Engineers who had spent careers building pushrod V8s were now working with a configuration that demanded a completely different understanding of balance, vibration, and high RPM behavior. The learning curve was steep. The results, by most internal accounts, were genuinely impressive. But then the program did what ambitious programs inside large corporations almost always do. It grew. The V12 was no longer just an engine for a Jaguar sedan. Conversations began circulating about a dedicated flagship vehicle, something that would wear Ford's own badge, or possibly an entirely new nameplate, and compete directly with the Mercedes S-Class and BMW 7 Series. The ambition had escalated beyond its original boundaries, and that escalation brought a new level of scrutiny from the people who controlled the budget. Every step forward made the eventual decision more consequential. The engineers kept pushing. The accountants kept watching. The comparisons being made inside Dearborn were not modest. Engineers and product planners were measuring this program directly against the BMW 750i and the Mercedes-Benz 600. Those were not simply cars, they were declarations. Machines that carried the accumulated weight of decades of European engineering mythology, and the kind of brand trust that cannot be manufactured inside a single development cycle. Ford knew this, and that knowledge created a psychological tension that ran through every meeting, every review, and every budget conversation connected to the program. Building an engine that could match European numbers on a dynamometer was achievable. Convincing a buyer who had spent 20 years associating prestige with a Stuttgart address to choose Dearborn instead was a different problem entirely, one that no amount of engineering excellence could fully solve alone. The resistance inside the company fed on that uncertainty. Reliability concerns were raised, some with genuine technical foundation, others deployed strategically by executives who had already decided the program was a distraction. The EPA's tightening fuel economy standards gave the opposition a regulatory argument to stand alongside the financial one. And the internal champions who had protected the program through its most vulnerable early stages were running out of political capital at exactly the wrong moment. What made this painful was the clarity of what was being sacrificed. This was not a flawed program being correctly terminated. This was a competitive program being defeated not by its own limitations, but by the institutional fear of what success in that market would actually demand of a company that had never truly committed to it. The engine was ready. Ford was not. The exact number of complete engines built during this program has never been fully confirmed. That ambiguity is itself part of the story. Ford's documentation on the V12 project remains scattered, partially absent from official histories, and buried inside archives the company has never chosen to open. What is known is that the program progressed far enough to produce running examples. far enough that engineers who were present during testing still speak about it with the specific reverence reserved for things that deserved to exist but never did. When the decision came to shelve it, there was no announcement, no farewell, no acknowledgement that something remarkable had just been quietly extinguished. The funding stopped, the engineers moved on, and the prototypes disappeared into the kind of institutional silence that large corporations maintain around their most uncomfortable, almost victories. Jaguar eventually received a V12 carrying a different story. Ford's American-developed 12-cylinder flagship never reached a single customer. The market it was built to conquer spent the next 3 decades belonging entirely to Germany. But here is what stays with you when you follow this story all the way to the end. Ford did not fail because the engine was bad. Every account suggests it was genuinely competitive. Ford failed because the people with the power to say yes ran out of courage before the engineers ran out of ideas. That is a different kind of failure, and it is the kind that leaves a mark on history not as a cautionary tale, but as a permanent, unanswered question about what could have been sitting in showrooms around the world. Some roads end not with a crash, but with a quiet decision made in a boardroom by men who simply blinked.